Hello everyone. This lecture is on cultural appropriation. It is a part of your paper on culture, media and society. This module introduces the process of appropriation, where the focus is on how audiences make use of media text. The shift is from the origin or source, that is the encoding, to the effects or results, that is the decoding of media text. It will delineate the process of how media text is interpreted, related, and used by the media audience in their everyday lives. Appropriation is a complex process of usage, selection, and rejection of media messages depending upon the context. Through this module, you will understand the process of decoding media text. It will help you make the sense of most media texts, images, and forms of media that you come across in your everyday lives. You will come to know how media is not at all as powerful as it seems. Rather, it is the audience who make use of the media within their social cultural context. Part 1. Appropriation, the concept. Let us begin with the concept of appropriation itself. The dictionary meaning of the term appropriation refers to the act of taking something for your own use, usually without permission. However, for this particular lecture, appropriation needs to be understood as the ways in which different subcultural groups read, interpret, and use the media text as per their social experiences and expectations. It deals mostly with the process of decoding of media text and images. The major proponent of this stance of cultural appropriation is the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, popularized by Stuart Hall. The center took a standpoint of looking at subcultural practices of how each subcultural group deals with the media text. It did not assume a unilinear linkage between the class positions, experience, structure of feeling, and culture. For example, the same media text viewed by upper class women will not be decoded in a similar fashion by the virtue of their gender or class, rather through their individual experiences and ways of interpreting the media text. We can also see a similar standpoint in the works of John Berger's Ways of Seeing. Before we move ahead, let us look at what we have learned till now. First, appropriation is the ways in which different subcultural groups read, interpret, and use the media text as per their social experiences and expectations. Here, to understand this, the shift is from encoding to decoding of media text. The major proponent of this stance is the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which was popularized by Stuart Hall. And this particular center took a standpoint of looking at subcultural practices and how each of the subcultural groups deal with their media text. Part 2. Mediation through appropriation, the process. After knowing the concept of appropriation, we need to understand the process of cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is the shift in focus from media text to the audience who try to resolve the mediated conflict which is created in media text by the producers. They provide the solution through their own experiences rather than taking the solution provided by the media. Now let us address the concept of style as an aid to appropriation. One of the key concepts to understand the process of appropriation is style. Style acts as a new mediatic term between social and cultural. According to Grossberg, style is a representation of and an imaginary solution to the experienced contradictions within the everyday lives of members of subculture, which means the subcultural groups incorporate their experiences in understanding the media text. Grossberg asserts that the text becomes polysemy, which means that is open to different interpretations. Now let us address types of decoding and appropriation. To understand the process of appropriation, we need to discuss and understand Hall's types of decoding and appropriation. Stuart Hall said that media texts are polyvocal, and thus he gave three types of decoding and appropriation, which are: first, preferred or dominant decoding; second, oppositional decoding; and third, negotiational decoding. Let us begin with preferred or dominant decoding. Hall opines that during encoding, particular meanings are inserted or implied into the structure of the media text by the producers, which are expected to be decoded by the audience in a similar fashion. Hall believes that the motive behind such act is to support the interests of the dominant groups. For example, in places where corporate lobbies are building a dam by displacing the indigenous people without giving them proper rehabilitation, they might control the media with the images of development. They would try to propel the idea of development that are without showing the plight of indigenous people due to the coming of the dam. The audiences far away from the politics might end up believing the protests made by the indigenous people against the dam is an act of violence. They might fail to understand how, in the name of development, displacement of indigenous people is taking place in the area. The producer of such media texts thus succeed in disseminating their idea of development to the audiences. Second, oppositional decoding. The second type is the oppositional decoding, where it is an assumption that the audience will receive the intended message as encoded by the producer, and therefore there exists an alternate or oppositional codes derived from their own subcultural formations, which are opposed to the preferred readings, that are the readings preferred by the producer. If we take the same example and say that the media message was understood from the perspective of the indigenous people as audience, we will get a different type of reading of the same media messages. The displaced indigenous people might not believe the stories of development that the media producer is trying to propagate. This is because they are the sufferers and victims of this dam construction and thus cannot identify with the media images of development. The third type of decoding is negotiated decoding, which occurs when the audience partly incorporate the intended message of the producer and partly interpret the message as per the codes available to them through their social experiences. The key to understand this decoding is not through the notion of active or passive viewing, but through the struggles and contestation with which audience try to make meaning of media texts which are made available to them. However, we must remember that all these types of reading does not imply that the practice of newsmaking is always biased to serve the interests of the dominant group. Rather, it reveals that the circulation of meaning in journalistic field, which operates through several professional codes with an aim to produce neutral and objective news. However, they end up producing texts that support the existing structures of power. Let us do a quick revision before we move ahead. In this part, we learned that cultural appropriation shifts the focus from media text to the audience, who tries to resolve the mediated conflict through their own experiences rather than taking the solution offered by the media. One of the key concepts to understand this process that we studied was style. And according to Grossberg, style is a representation of and an imaginary solution to the experience contradictions within the everyday lives of the members of subculture, which means that the subcultural groups incorporate the experiences to understand the media text. We also learned 3 types of decoding media text given by Stuart Hall, and we also understood how media texts are polyvocal. Part 3. The nationwide audience, a case of appropriation. In order to demonstrate the above mentioned 3 types of decoding the text, let us look at a study by Bronstein and Morley. They did an analysis of how audience interpret the TV program nationwide. Drawing upon the semiotics, they identified the codes that the text offers for interpretation, such as the mode of address, tone, pitch, and the nature of presentation, that is, whether it was formal or informal. A careful examination of the codes gave them an idea about the ways in which TV programs try to create a bridge between the medium, the message, and the audience. They established through their study that the meaning of media messages should not be sought only within the text, but should be extended to the ways in which audience make meaning or sense of these texts based on their social experiences. Therefore, to their second study, which they conducted in 1980, Bronstein and Morley tried to demonstrate how different groups within the audience actually decoded the same text. It is through this process of identification that audience read the preferred meaning of text, that is, the preferred meaning given by the producer. However, they also pointed out that if the audience does not identify with the preferred meaning of the text, then identification gets challenged, leading to oppositional reading of the text. Morley argues that how a text is decoded depends on the codes available to the audience through his or her social surroundings. He makes use of Pierre Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital in order to explain this. But what is cultural capital? Cultural capital refers to the knowledge, skills, values, and other such non-material possessions that one acquires during his or her lifetime on the basis of class positions. For example, someone in the rural area may not know how to eat with the fork and knife that the upper classes have created and follow. This becomes a basis of distinction between the classes. Cultural capital therefore implies a means to understand the process of decoding. Before we move ahead, we should recap what we have done in part 3. Through the study of Bronstein and Morley of how audiences interpret the TV program nationwide, we learned the concept of cultural capital given by Pierre Bourdieu. Cultural capital refers to the knowledge, skills, values, and other such non-material possessions that one acquires during his or her lifetime on the basis of their class positions. And it is through this cultural capital that different groups within the audience decode the same text differently. Cultural capital therefore becomes a basis of distinction between classes and acts as a means to understand the process of decoding. Part 4. Cultural Forms and Scenarios of Appropriation in India. Now let us discuss the cases of appropriation of two cultural forms in India, novels and street plays. There are different kinds of dynamics related to the process of encoding and decoding a media text, such as the socio-economic context of a particular period of time. For example, Western modernity was identified by the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. In colonial India, however, these values were used to differentiate between the East and the West. This gave us the idea of material and moral superiority of the European civilization. However, these values were appropriated or used by the colonized Indian population to wage a freedom struggle against the colonizers, to the fact that these values were then incorporated in our own constitution. Now let us see the first case of appropriation in the case of a novel by Premchand. Premchand's novel Rangbhumi, set in colonial India, reconstructs an ideal village which was not characterized by robust caste system and class disparities. The main character of the story, a Dalit, who is opposed to Christianity because he believes that it is the religion of the oppressor. The common enemy for all evil was the British, and therefore the internal disputes were sidelined and the fight against the British Raj was put in the forefront. The plot in Rangbhumi revolves around the resistance at two levels, cultural and political. The resistance put forth against industrialism and Christianity is identified as cultural resistance, whereas the fight against the colonial regime is considered to be a political one. The village community becomes a microcosm of the nation, and the resistance offered by the villager is symbolic of the Indian people's struggle for freedom from the colonial rule. Here the appropriation could be understood in the ways Premchand puts certain familiar codes and similes with which the reader of the novel can identify in order to create a sense of nation. The second case of appropriation is analyzing theatre in Maharashtra. Hema Rairkar, in 2010, through her study of street theatre in Maharashtra, found how a group of social animators who appropriated the issue of deserted women in rural Maharashtra through their codes that would easily be identified with the audience familiar with it. The play was a success as it initiated a reflective social awareness of the condition of abandoned women. Its success was also attributed to the emotional connection with the audience, as they belonged to the same social group from which the play originated. Emotional connectivity was due to the use of familiar codes identified by the audience, such as gestures, words, practices, and other verbal forms used by men in their everyday lives to silence women. The familiarity also extended to the choice of traditional songs, which has carried the message of gender inequality since ages. These songs were intentionally included to allow older village women to recognize themselves in their representation. All dramatic actions were localized and personalized in order to connect with the audience with the right kind of message. Hema Rairkar also points out that the same play did not evoke the similar and immediate response among the urban spectators in comparison to their rural counterparts, as they could not identify or refer to the issue. In this study, the appropriation can be understood at two levels. First, at the level of encoding, that is how the group of animators use familiar codes to convey their message. Secondly, at the level of decoding, where the audience could identify with the codes and relate to the message which was intended by the performers. Now let us try to conclude this lecture. I hope through this discussion you have understood that cultural appropriation is one of the ways to understand mediation, where the meaning of the text is not looked at within the text, but also looks at the ways in which audience make use of these texts through their cultural codes and experiences. One would assume that if the audience does preferred reading, they are labeled as passive, while if they indulge in oppositional reading, they are considered to be active. However, appropriation moves a bit ahead from this dichotomy and considers the position of how audience negotiates with the media text and tries to make meaning out of it, drawing upon the socio-cultural codes made available to them. The key to understand cultural appropriation is to look around us and examine cultural codes made available to us and which are used to make sense of our everyday lives, including media texts. Thus, we make use of tools, that is, cultural codes, available to us while reading media texts as such and giving meaning to them. It is our everyday interaction and exchange of codes that is more useful and powerful to take part in the process of cultural appropriation. The power, therefore, does not lie within the text, but what we make of the text. For more details, please look at the modules carefully and attempt all the questions given at the end. Thank you.